Hi everyone, I'll be giving a small recap on the resurrection of Jesus. So as you all can recall from Junbo Lao's talk, he actually gave a test regarding Christianity and for us to see whether Christianity is true or not. And this is actually recorded for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. As you can see, the resurrection of Jesus is actually a very important topic. It's written for us that if Christ has not been raised, then our faith is futile. Everything that we are doing in church or in our daily life, like our quiet time, our prayer, our tithing, is all futile because Christ has not been raised. And thus, being a Christian actually requires knowing the resurrection well, understanding it, and being able to answer the question, how do you know Christianity is true? And so, to answer this question, we will actually be using a framework that I've introduced previously in my talk. It's known to most philosophers as the inference to the best explanation. So once again, this is something that all of us use, even though we might not realize. So basically, when given a set of evidences, we are basically trying to find what is the best explanation that we can to explain these evidences. And given a set of evidence, we have a whole list of explanation, and we are trying to find which is the best explanation. And to do that, we can actually ask these 4 questions about the explanations to determine which is basically the best explanation, and thus the title, Inference to the Best Explanation. Okay, so here are the questions that we can use. So the first question, does this explanation explain all the evidence? And this is also termed as the explanatory scope. Secondly, the question is, how well does this explanation explain the evidences? So while an explanation can explain all of the evidence, it might not be able to explain the evidence better than another explanation. The next question that we can ask is actually, is this explanation more plausible than the rest? So given the evidences, we want to ask whether this explanation does it have a higher chance of being true compared to the rest? And lastly, we would like to ask whether this explanation actually assume any other evidences that is actually not established. An explanation that doesn't actually assume an additional evidence would actually be a better one. So now that we are clear with the framework, I will dive straight into the evidences that we have surrounding the resurrection of Jesus. And basically, what we will do is we will be trying to use the framework to determine which is the best explanation that explains these evidences. So the 3 evidences that we'll be looking at surrounding the resurrection of Jesus is basically his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith. So just a side note, all these 3 facts are actually considered reliable by theists and non-theists alike. So basically, people who don't believe in Jesus and people who believe in Jesus all believe that these 3 facts are true. And so we will actually like to use the framework that I've described just now to find a best explanation that can explain all these 3 evidences. So I will now start explaining what these evidences are. So the first evidence that we'll be looking at is Jesus's empty tomb. It basically says that the tomb that Jesus was buried in was actually found empty 3 days after his death by some of Jesus's women followers. So the second evidence that we'll be looking at is Jesus's post-mortem appearances. It basically states that Jesus appeared to many of his followers after his death at multiple locations. The list of people is actually recorded for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 3 to 8. What Paul is actually saying here, he's telling the Corinthian church that, if you don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, right, you can go and ask all these people. He basically gave the Corinthian church a list of names that they can ask to see whether, Jesus actually appeared to them. And why would he do that if, in fact, Jesus did not rise from the dead, right? Okay, and the third evidence that we'll be looking at is actually the origin of Christian faith. It basically states that, Jesus's disciples, despite having no reason to believe in Jesus's identity as the Messiah, as the King of the Jews, as the Son of God, despite having no reasons to believe all of that, they sincerely came to believe afterwards. And there is this event that actually caused this change of heart. They sincerely believed that Jesus died for the sins of humanity and rose from the dead 3 days after. And they held on to this belief so strongly that they were even willing to die for it. Okay, so given all these 3 evidences, we would actually like to find the best explanation that can explain these 3 evidences. So given the evidences, over the years, people have actually been coming up with different hypotheses to explain away the evidences without affirming that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And I will now briefly mention what these hypotheses are. So the first we have is the conspiracy hypothesis. It basically says that, Jesus's disciples actually came in the middle of the night to steal Jesus's body away from the tomb and then basically lied about his post-mortem appearances afterwards afterwards and managed to convince the early Christian of Jesus' resurrection. The second hypothesis is the apparent death hypothesis. It basically says that when Jesus was hung on the cross and left to die, he wasn't actually 100% dead, and so he was actually placed in the tomb without actually dying first, and afterwards in the middle of the night he actually escaped from the tomb, took off his burial clothes, escaped the tomb, and basically went back to Jerusalem to convince his disciples that, yo, I died and then I rose from the dead. The third hypothesis is the hallucination hypothesis. Basically, this hypothesis is trying to explain the second evidence of Jesus' post-mortem appearances by saying that all of the disciples who actually thought that they saw Jesus were actually hallucinating about Jesus, and after they experienced that hallucination, they actually came to believe that they really saw Jesus. Okay, the fourth hypothesis is actually the wrong tomb hypothesis. It says that the women, when they actually went to the tomb of Jesus on the third day after his burial, they actually went to the wrong tomb, and being as distraught as they were, they actually believed that Jesus rose from the dead. They ran back to tell the disciples that the tomb was empty, and from there the disciples actually took the empty tomb and actually developed into the whole story of Jesus rising from the dead. So if you take the explanations and examine them one by one, you will realize that they actually fail at explaining the three evidences in one way or another. And that leaves us with the most obvious explanation. God the Father raised Jesus from the dead. So if you look at it, the resurrection hypothesis is able to explain all of the evidence, and it is also able to explain all of the evidence well. The only thing perhaps that someone can say about it is that, is it really plausible? Is there really a God that actually can perform miracles and raise a dead man? And if you look at Jesus' story, his life and his ministry, and you understand it in its proper context in the ancient Jewish time, you realize that this assumption is not even one that is questionable. Everyone back then believes that there is a God out there who is able to perform miracles and raise someone from the dead. And thus, taken together, we realize that out of all the explanations that we have heard, the resurrection hypothesis is actually the best explanation that can explain the three evidences. Okay, so to sum up, I would actually like to reference a quote by Dr. William Craig, who wrote the book Reasonable Faith, the materials of which I use for this talk. These three facts, the resurrection appearances, the empty tomb, and the origin of the Christian faith, all point unavoidably to one conclusion: the resurrection of Jesus. Today, the rational man can hardly be blamed if he believes that on the first Easter morning, a divine miracle occurred. Now that we have shown that Jesus actually rose from the dead, the question that we should be asking is, so what? As Christians, we should all be very clear of what we believe in and why we believe in it. And the answer should start from Jesus' life, his death, and ends with his resurrection. And this will be what we will be studying for the rest of the year at FIG. Now I have come to the end of my recap, so I hope that you all will be reminded of what you have heard, and you all will be able to think more deeply about what you have learned so far. And if you have any questions, do leave them down in the comments below, and we will try to respond to it. Thank you.